My name is Ciaran Butler, and I'm the director of the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to our keynote session on Britain's role in the global trade landscape. And we're incredibly fortunate to have with us for this discussion the Right Honourable Jonathan Reynolds, Secretary of State for Business and Trade. Prior to taking up his current role, the Secretary of State had a very wide-ranging set of portfolios: Shadow Transport Minister, Shadow City Minister, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and I think Shadow Business Minister.
It's a really polite way of pointing out how long we were in opposition for. Full duration
but
for
not,
me.
Notwithstanding that, he is now one of the most important economic decision makers in the current government. And it's also, as we all know, an enormously busy time in the trade space. So the fact that you've been able to spare the time, take the time to be with us today, I mean, we're enormously grateful for that. Just a few quick housekeeping points to remind everybody. This discussion is on the record and it's being live streamed on our Chatham House conference platform. I'm going to start with a few questions with the Secretary of State and then open it up to the audience. But we want to use that time as effectively as possible. So please make your questions brief and specific, and we will take as many as we can. And then we have a hard stop at 11:30. So, Secretary of State, I mean, we had last night another policy from President Trump, but it's part of a dramatic and rapid change in the US's role in the global economy, and frankly, we don't know where it's going to end up. So it can't really be that easy to write a trade strategy, let alone publish one, I have to say, in these circumstances. So it's coming very soon, I think next month. Can you tell us what we can expect? And in particular, how far are we going to see some real choices made in that strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Ciaran. Well, thank you for this invite, for this lovely
This man and his government are complicit in genocide.
Excuse me, sir.
The F-35s are massacring Palestinians, and they have not stopped the trade of F-35s. 400 Palestinians killed last Tuesday, 200 children. One of the largest massacres of Palestinian children in history. And they're selling F-35 parts. F-35, suspend the sales. Suspend the sales, all of them, all of the parts.
Secretary of State, if
well,
we
could... we have suspended arms exports to Israel. We haven't suspended F-35s because they are integral to our national security, and particularly the defence of Ukraine. And people will know the supply chain for the F-35s means they cannot be isolated to one country. And that decision was laid out very clearly in Parliament. So quite happy, colleague would want to ask a question rather than jump on stage to have had that engagement with him. I mean, look, on your question on the trade strategy.
In genocide, this government is still exporting F-35 parts for Israel. Stop arming Israel! End the genocide! Stop arming Israel! Free Palestine! Stop arming Israel! End the genocide! Stop arming Israel! Stop arming
So, Secretary of State, I'm really sorry about this. I think everybody wants to hear your views on trade and so on. And
but as I say, we would be more than happy if they want to ask
we can get to that point
that question and do that. I mean, so yes, another quiet week to be a G7 trade minister. I think we should say that. Look, to try and get to the questions quickly, I mean, look, you start with the trade strategy and what is in the UK's national interest. Right? And that is always going to be in an open, rules-based trading system. And you have to acknowledge, as you've said, that you have to deal with the world as it is, not as you would like it to be, and that is incredibly challenging. But if you go to, you know, if this was an audience of investors and I was pitching the UK, the three things I would say is to start with political stability, which we've returned to after the election. I would then talk about openness as a competitive advantage for the UK. And then I'd talk about how we're using that big mandate in the House of Commons to improve the business environment. But on the point of openness, because I do think, Ciaran, you can take a challenging situation and if you do it well, turn it to your advantage. That's not easy, but that's what we can do. You know, that is why in opposition, in the manifesto, we pledged we would continue to do the trade deal with India, which I'm very excited about. It's why we said we'd do the same with the GCC. It's why we've done the accession to CPTPP. It's why we said we will engage with China. It's a different relationship, but I think the UK being an outlier on engagement with China has not yielded positive results for the UK. And we believe we can do that at the same time as the EU reset. So this idea we should pick between certain markets or have to make choices that exclude certain opportunities, I don't think that can be our strategy post-Brexit. I really don't. And specifically on the trade strategy, yes, it's going to have some real meat, as I would call it. I know sometimes governments produce plans that have a lot of good analysis or sentiment in, but not that. But it will include some real decisions, some real policy decisions. It will include a conversation about how trade policy has to be more than just FTAs. I think there's a sense that the Department of International Trade, as it was something of a sort of FTA factory and didn't get into those other issues. We'll address difficult things like the decline in exports post-Brexit and why we've got to identify that. Whether we've got the right toolkit for trade defence in this world will feature. And of course, other policy issues. There's been a conversation this week about supply chains and forced labour. And, to us, you have to do that not on a sector-by-sector basis, but as part of a trade strategy. So hopefully for yourself and an audience like this, you will be most intrigued and excited.
Yeah, we're all looking forward to it. You mentioned just talking about FTAs is not enough, and in a way that gets you into the question of the broader system of global trade rules.
Yeah.
Enshrined in the WTO, and up until, if you like, President Trump took office. Notwithstanding the buffeting had taken, it was still functioning pretty well in a number of areas. As we look forward, it's under even more pressure now. And yet the US is the only country really saying this isn't how we want to work. So to what extent in the trade strategy is there going to be an effort by the UK with other countries to try and shore up that global trading system and the rules, the principles, even the values on which it's based in the face of what President Trump is doing?
I'm a tremendous supporter of Dr. Ngozi, and she would make the point, as I'm sure you've all in this audience heard her say, that even accounting for these pressures, just look at how significant a proportion of global trade is still conducted on WTO terms. It's 75%. And also look at the pressures the global system has been under and the fact that global trade is still rising by a not insignificant figure this year and will continue to do so. Look, the basis of a UK trade strategy has got to be what's in the UK's national interest. So I can't fight battles for other countries, but our national interest is in that cooperation with other countries. I don't think it's necessarily right just to point to the US on it. There are other countries who have objections to plurilateral arrangements, not least then the multilateral picture that comes into that. So, there are these concerns and tensions, but there are still areas within that. If you think about the e-commerce initiative, we were very supportive of it. So sometimes it's going to be horses for courses, what's available as a way to do it. But in terms of how I suppose your question is, how much of a commitment in there will we see to trying to make the rules-based system work in this challenging environment? Yes, that will feature.
Yeah. One of the issues you've kind of highlighted is the extent if you have an individual country that's blocking a certain aspect of the way the WTO works. There is an approach of workarounds. Basically, you put something in parallel to the WTO, might deal with dispute settlement, might be a way of progressing, for example, agreements on e-commerce and so on. But so how far do you think the UK should participate in those workarounds? Up to now, we've been hesitant, particularly on, say, the dispute settlement side. As we go forward, do you think there's going to be more role for the UK in helping to craft and sustain those, workarounds?
I can get some specific things we could or may not participate in. Look, yes, we keep them under review. The trade strategy will speak specifically to those. And I think, again, perhaps not the public, but certainly this audience would appreciate there are some difficult areas for us. We have a manifesto commitment to maintaining our SPS regime. That's something we, very much committed to. That is not always something other countries see eye to us on. So we've got to balance those interests across all government departments, not just from a trade perspective as to what that means. But I think it's also important to say that on some of these things we will have to, and it has always been the case, we have to engage bilaterally on them. And I think there's always a need to recognise, let's take the US, just the most obvious example of that. You have to understand that the politics in a country that has led to a view of those multilateral institutions and why they're taking that view. And I think with the US, what we've done is say, look, we obviously have a different set of views to the way they're coming at this from, but we will respect the mandate, we'll understand why they're putting that forward. It's, strictly for the WTO for the US, it is a belief on their side that it hasn't got the right tools to deal with the problems of particularly overcapacity, overproduction in some key sectors, and you can understand and engage with that even if you don't necessarily agree with it. And I just think on this whole set of issues, and I was talking to you earlier about listening to the Today programme as ever full of advice for every cabinet minister, this is a time for cool heads, right? Cool heads and pragmatism when it comes to it, and that is how we're approaching these things.
One last question for me, and then we'll come to the audience, which is essentially about trade with China, but in particular on the issue of green tech goods, which, China has some really good green tech. It might have been subsidized in terms of its development, but it's there, available now, it's really cheap. Up to now, we've taken a somewhat different route to the EU, for example, on EVs. What is our strategy vis-a-vis Chinese green tech generally? How far are we constrained by what the US may or may not want us to do? What do you see as being in the UK national interest in this?
Just a small little question at the end.
A small question.
Cheers for that. So, look, first of all, we've taken a different view to some partners because we've got different national interests. So the UK automotive sector is a heavily export-led sector. Both China and the US are key export markets for it. So we approach that issue from not just what is coming into the UK, but how can we defend our export markets that are important to us. I think there's a general sense in the UK that underestimates the level of innovation in China in this area. Of course, there are issues about non-market practices. Of course, there are things that come from the sheer scale of production. But, I think sometimes people don't appreciate just how cutting edge some of the stuff we're seeing is and how competitive it is from a kind of consumer preference point of view as well. There are areas where, frankly, the Chinese lead is already quite significant, and I don't see, for instance, the UK or any European country take solar PV. China dominates that market. The same is true, I think, for a lot of battery technology. The majority of UK-China trade is not in particularly contentious areas, right? I think I lost a factory near my constituency after the pandemic because we couldn't reopen pork exports, right? That's not a contentious area. It's not this cutting-edge technology, and it's not, any sort of economic security element of that question. So we've got to engage with a fifth of the world economy. The conservative view, which is just pretend China doesn't exist. I'm sorry, I don't think that's realistic whatsoever. The concerns that we have about overproduction in key areas and non-market practices are widely held, and we have to work with allies around those things. But at the same time, there is, I believe, a space, and pork exports would be an obvious example, where we can work more closely. But on either way, Creon, whichever way we go on some of these particular areas, there is nothing to be gained from just pretending China doesn't exist, right? And I think that is, if you look at how the UK has been a massive outlier for political engagement with China under the last government, I think all of that golden era phase of Osborne and Cameron was pretty naive. We're not seeking to replicate that. But equally, look how assertive some of that US agenda has been towards China, and look at their political engagement. The two things are not inconsistent.
In the 80s, through Japanese foreign direct investment, we effectively revived our car industry. Obviously, the world is very different. We're not in the EU now. There are security issues with China that didn't exist with Japan. But how much of a parallel do you see? And in particular, the scope to attract further Chinese investment with the same goal in mind, but in these green tech areas?
It's an example I think of a lot because I grew up in Sunderland, so it's a great example of Japanese inward investment. As an approach to industrial strategy, I like the idea of where you want to bring in partners, you go and find the best in the world, and you make the UK a base for that as an export-led industry. I don't think China and Japan are in the same place on this question. I think there are areas that are less contentious, where we've already got significant, we've inherited Chinese investment in a whole range of parts of the economy, right? I wouldn't necessarily see them as the partner I want to bring in as a first preference in some of those sensitive areas. Where it's sensitive, I think it is a different question. So I wouldn't necessarily pick Japan and China as parallels around that. But I think in terms of being open to the best in the world coming to the UK, as a general approach to industrial strategy, yes, that's something that features very heavily in our pitch to stability, openness, and that business environment improving.
Thank you very much. Right, let's get some questions, and we'll take a selection. So I've got one gentleman on the far side there. A mic will come to you very quickly, a lady at the front here, and a gentleman over there. So, quick question, please.
Thank you. My name is Eli Tokpa. I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Chatham House Future Conversation Initiative. I'd love to discuss the potential for cooperation and innovation with the height of cooperation with China. But to address the protesters that came in, I must ask the question, we talked about national interest. How can we support business deals being made with leaders who are pursued by the ICJ? We talked this morning about weaponizing the trade system with tariffs, with the current policies. How can we follow a rules-based system right now? How do you justify this to your constituents? How do you justify this to yourself and the international community? Thank you.
I think we've got that question. Lady at the front here, please.
Good to see you, Secretary of
Good to see
State.
you.
Thanks for your comments. I know that you're in intensive...
Just say who you are, please.
Oh, sorry. I'm Lizzie Burden from Bloomberg, and I'm going to host the next panel.
You are indeed, yes.
Shamelessly jumping ahead of the order, Lizzie.
I'm so sorry, but I had to ask you. I know that you're in intensive talks with Washington at the moment, and we've heard a lot from the Chancellor over the past 24 hours. She has not ruled out scrapping the digital services tax as a bargaining chip to get out of tariffs from the US. Would you take that opportunity today?
Thank you very much. And then we have one last from the gentleman just at the back there, and then another round. So thanks very much for these questions.
Thank you very much. Oliver Wright from The Times. Sort of following on from that question, can you just set the level of expectation for what a trade deal with the US might look like? Is it realistic? Is it realistic that
Cheers, mate, yeah.
we could have tariffs excluded?
Sure, okay. Great. Eli, I'll try and answer these questions briefly to get many people in. Your question, I think, was about rules-based system and I think an element on arms exports around that. So look, similar to what I said to Creon, I believe a rules-based system is in the UK's interest for an intensive trade-based economy. That's what we should be seeking to promote and use as the basis of that. But we live in the real world and there are challenges. And specifically on arms exports, we have a very stringent regime which we have applied as a government, and that has led to restrictions, particularly in relation to arms exports to Israel, and the national security exemption for F-35s is well set out in Parliament, and I think a very sound and reasonable basis to go forward on. Lizzie, on DST, I mean, look, tech companies paying a fair amount of tax in the UK is something that's incredibly important to us, and I think the British people. You will know that DST was introduced as a temporary measure in lieu of an international agreement, the OECD measures on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 for taxation, recognising the structure of digital taxation was different to what historically we've seen in terms of where economic activity in the country takes place. So we have always been of the view as a country that this has to be something ideally agreed on an international basis, but it's not that DST has sort of been put in place as something that can never change, or we never have a conversation about it. So we are both committed to making sure tech companies pay a fair rate of tax in the UK for their economic activity in the UK. But we understand the US has cited, as it has to countries around the world, concerns about the specific structure about that. So in terms of this conversation, they'll want to talk to us about that. It's not the major part of the conversation. No, I understand why. It's obviously newsworthy given the prominence of all major tech firms in our lives. But let's just remember, what is our objective as a country here? It's that fair rate of taxation. But we've always been willing, the whole point of this was to do that on an international basis. So I think maybe people are getting a little bit ahead of themselves and sort of thinking there might be some US demands which actually are slightly different to the nature of that conversation. And all of our expectations on it, I mean, can I tell you tonight? I mean, look, what I would say on this is there has been a calm-headed approach from the UK government, right? And it has been on the basis of the fact that clearly if you take what the US has said about its trading relationships around the world, well, okay, but by their own definition, we have a fair and balanced one between the US and the UK. There is no major US deficit on goods with the UK. So we're in a different position to some countries. In terms of the conversation and the areas that it covers, there are obviously potentially some real opportunities for the UK. If small businesses or any business in the UK could trade more freely with that US market, of course that's something I'm interested in. And I think where the US has concerns, the sort of the intellectual criticisms that are built up, particularly in the Republican Party, around how some of those trading relationships affect US production or affect US workers, where some of those concerns are there on the US side, well, we would probably share some of those as well. So there's a basis for a really good conversation. It's challenging. There's no, way to avoid saying that. And particularly our view would have been that, we would not have wanted any tariffs applied to the UK whilst we're having this conversation, but we're pretty close to what the US calls World Tariff Day next week. So we're continuing an incredibly intensive set of negotiations, and we will know pretty soon what the outcome of that will be.
Thanks very much. Let's get another round of questions. We have a lady at the front here, and I'd like to also there's a lady further back. If we go to lady front here, lady in the middle back there, and a gentleman over on the far side. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Yes, I'm the High Commissioner representing Zambia. Thank you, Honorable Reynolds. Just a quick question, because one of the questions that I think was on the agenda to be asked was the role that trade plays in the UK's government approach to foreign and development policy. So just kind of juxtaposing that. And your thoughts in terms of trade with the African continent moving forward, particularly because we've had in the areas of critical minerals as we go through the green transition. Yeah. China has traded with the continent for many years, and I think that that's what's put them where they are now in terms of access to critical minerals and be able to be in the position they are, particularly in things like EVs, et cetera. So just to get a sense of where the UK is around that.
Thank you, High Commissioner. And I can see a lady in the middle of the back there.
Hi, thank you. Sarah Simmons, Treasury Legal Advisors. Jonathan, you speak about some really complex trade issues that bring into play lots of different policy areas, where not just trade. How can you see Whitehall working to help combine these, and what do you think the pressures are that it's placing on us at the moment?
Great
Thank you.
And one more. I think there was a gentleman in the he's disappeared. So maybe this gentleman with the green tag here. Let's go to him.
Hi, Rob Powell from Sky News. Are you going to up your offer to the Chinese owner of British Steel, and how worried are you about the prospect of job losses if an agreement can't be reached?
Great, some light questions as well. Very good. For the High Commissioner, I mean, if David was here, friend of the Foreign Secretary, he would absolutely, I'm sure you've heard him say, once that relationship with Africa pivoted much more to a conversation about trade and opportunities around there. I mean, on the international UK footprint, DBT and the Foreign Office work very closely together, but we have a slightly different remit. We prioritise some of the higher value markets and that longer term, because I think the point for the African continent is not so much about the value now, but what it means for the future, and credible opportunities, credible population growth, forecast. The Foreign Office deals a little bit more with that, but in terms of the UK's relationship to Africa, that is certainly the lens to which we want to be increasing the way that is considered in the work that we do here from the UK. Sarah, questions about how all of Whitehall works. I mean, generally, I've got so much I could say, Sarah. I mean, 9 months in, probably not with our friends from the press here. One of the interesting things I think about DBT, I began as the Shadow Minister before the then Prime Minister created DBT, is to cover everything from people's local high street and pub to these very significant geopolitical strategic issues. I mean, what a incredible job, but incredible responsibility to do it. And one of the interesting things is both on the business and the trade side, a lot of the key equities, as people call them in Whitehall, are owned by different departments. So, if I want to make sure we've got a strong automotive sector in the UK, some of the key policies are in the transport team or have implications for carbon budgets. If I'm talking about trade, there are very significant DEFRA interests in that, or DCID around technology, that conversation that we've had here. So some of that, I think, is still evolving, because trade is just still relatively recently a domestic political responsibility. And I think, given that sort of Whitehall works with these empires sort of struggling and fighting each other on different things, that has been quite tense. I get the sense that in the previous Conservative government, the old Department of International Trade wasn't the most popular amongst colleagues in terms of how they operated around that. Some nervous laughter in the room as former employees of that department. And I think, look, what's particularly around the US, the speed at which this is having to be done because of the agenda and the mandate the US has for that, has meant we've had to do things in a slightly different way, particularly what we call the SSG, the Senior Strategy Group, the Prime Minister chairs and the key players around. So we're having to think about doing things in different ways, and we have to continue that conversation. And I'll finish there, that we could probably do a full conference here at Chatham House on how Whitehall is configured for trade. And Rob, look, on British Steel, you will know the new government came with not just an ambition, but real money behind our steel strategy. We've obviously seen our work with Tata in Port Talbot, and we've been negotiating with British Steel since the government was elected. I think it's in the public domain. I think it might have been broken by Sky News that an offer has been made about the transformation, and we haven't got an agreement as it stands. But it is a very, very challenging situation. I mean, both in terms of, it's not just about the level of resource, and I've got to make sure there's the right deal for the taxpayer as part of that. obviously I need to know that there's a viable business being created at the end of that. I need guarantees on jobs. If I'm putting public money in, I need to, make sure that the customer base for the downstream mills, people will know Scunthorpe's our main construction steel site, very important for things like Network Rail and the railways. I need to know that, if the blast furnaces, if there's any change there, the downstream mills will have the steel to continue the supply to those key customers. So there's lots of different aspects to it. We are in continual negotiation with them, and I will continue to do that. But I want there to be a strong future for the steel industry in the UK. I think there are opportunities around that if we get it right. It's probably, Rob, to be honest, of all the industrial issues which I think the previous government neglected, if I'm being honest, whether it was Harland and Wolff and what we had to do there, or this is probably one of the, if not the hardest one that we've inherited.
Thank you very much. So we have one final round, and I'd like to take somebody right at the back, since we haven't done very well at the back. The gentleman there, and a gentleman here, and then I have a question, if I may, as well. So, gentleman right at the back.
Hello, Quentin Finance Trade Data Monitor. With regard to a potential Ukraine-US mineral deal and softening relations with Russia, where does the future of UK trade policy fall in line with that?
Thank you. Question here.
David Hennig, Eastside. Quick and easy question. How would you define economic security for the UK?
And my question, actually, which kind of covers a number of the sort of questions really about values and the role of values in trade policy. So one of the things President Trump has done is said that the DOJ will no longer enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which, as you will know and others will know, is the kind of centerpiece of global anti-corruption policy. Obviously, we have our Anti-Bribery Act. There's no suggestion we would do anything like that. But doesn't that really worry you about, in a sense, what's going to happen to the role of values in trade policy as we go forward?
Yeah, again, another really light round there. Questions. In the time we've got, I mean, look, on the US trade posture to Ukraine, I mean, I think there are lots of elements to that, but I do think there's a strong sort of economic interest from the UK, from the US, sorry, in terms of kind of the future of energy prices, and I think that is part of how they are viewing the potential end of the conflict in Ukraine, and particularly around the kind of deflationary pressure they would want to see that comes from that. And I think that's clearly one of the material factors in that. David, a definition of economic security. I mean, again, let's have a whole conference on this, I think, here. But I would say, look, a lot of conversations about trade, the ones that you and I have had, would start with it's not the 1990s anymore, right? And there's a set of geopolitical considerations upon which trade has taken place, which we have to be cognizant of, and we've seen through Ukraine and the pandemic, real disruption in a way that absolutely feeds through to people's energy bills, to their jobs, to the kind of political concerns that they've got and how they relate to government around that. And then we've got major, significant trading partners, where, look, there's a set of things we can do with China, but it's not the same as Europe or the US, and so you have to have these concerns in there. And I think how we communicate that to businesses in the UK, often whom don't really know where the lines are, what's safe, what's not safe, where the government might have concerns, and produces a chilling effect on the things that actually aren't very contentious, as well as not really being clearly defined in what we're trying to achieve on the economic security side. That's a problem. So when I talk about the trade strategy, looking at our toolkit around that, looking at how we provide that support to businesses from an exports point of view, that's what that will cover, and that's why I think economic security has to be a part of a trade strategy. And obviously there's a whole division of DBT which is economic security, and it was quite a welcome thing to find in the toolkit I've got coming in as a Secretary of State, but it's a very important part of those considerations. And then a question on values. I mean, look, values have to be the kind of country we want to be, and the kind of trade and the kind of economic opportunity we want. We can't separate those two things out. It can't be a sort of ruthless separation of the world as we want it to be from the world as it is. It's just we've got to recognise the world as it is, and we want to change it for the better. That's my point on that. I do think on some of these things, it's really legitimate and important to ask about the effectiveness of some measures, right? So one question I've got whenever I'm pitched, will you make British businesses do this or comply with this or align our rules with what goes on in other countries, is, look, are those rules effective? Because I see a lot of things, to be honest, which are very good headlines. And then when I say, is this, for instance, stopping the bad thing that it's designed to do? Well, we've got no evidence it is. and then you're just piling regulatory and compliance costs onto businesses, and you're not solving the problem. And I think some of the amendments we've had, to the GB Energy Bill, for instance, I mean, you've got to tackle this not sector by sector or bill by bill, but that's what the trade strategy's got to cover, and that's why it's a part of that. You also sort of hint in the question on, there's been clearly in some countries a conflation of trade strategy with other foreign policy objectives around that. But that can make it more challenging, but again, that is the world that we are in. I would say from a UK point of view, trade is a force for good. If you get it right, our values are integral in how we put that forward. We will always be an actor on the world stage seeking to promote that around it. And look, challenging as the world is, if we navigate it well, there are significant opportunities for the UK. I'm not saying it's easy to deliver them, but I think that's how we've got to approach this very complex landscape we live in.
Secretary of State, thank you very much. I mean, we didn't get into the EU, but we have a whole panel that we can cover on that later on. But thank you for your questions. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you very much.